Yeah, no, it's so interesting because your course is about data security.
Exactly,
Right?
yes.
And my course is about, or it includes demographic analysis because my course is about equity and DEI work within organizations. So when we met, it was really interesting because my perspective is like, please give me more so that I can conduct an equity analysis and figure out what's wrong with your organization. But also, you don't want to collect too much because then you violate people's anonymity and confidentiality. And then, you brought in the data security aspect of things. And I was like, whoa, we should do a podcast. So here we are.
Hey nerds, Monica here. Welcome to the Data Podcast for Nerds, where we get to talk to amazing professionals and ask them all about how they're using data to solve the world's problems. Today is a very special live episode. So I was recently in California recording my very first LinkedIn Learning course. And while I was there, my producer, Spencer Nichols, gave me the opportunity to record a podcast episode. So why not? In this episode, me and another LinkedIn Learning instructor, Lily Zheng, talk about our two courses and the overlap that our two topics have. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and also check out both of our LinkedIn Learning courses. And as always, folks, happy learning. Hi, I'm Monica K. Royal. I started out my career as a security auditor, and then I turned into a data professional, and now I'm just a chief data enthusiast for my own company, Nerd Nourishment, where I basically teach everyone nerdy data stuff.
That's super cool. Is that actually your title?
Yes, because I got to create my own title.
God, that's
absolutely.
so cool.
When you have your own company, you can just create your
I
own
also
title.
have my own company, but clearly I lack imagination because my title is principal. But that's
Well,
okay.
I wanted a chief, I wanted
Yeah,
to be in the
yeah.
C-suite, right? Because that's, dreams of everyone.
Sure,
So
sure,
I was
yeah.
chief data enthusiast.
Oh, I like it. A CDE. Hi, my name's Lily Zhang. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a principal, I guess, but I also call myself a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist. I run my own consulting firm, Zheng Consulting, and work with organizations to fix their shit, work on their DEI issues.
I'm plugging their book
It's
already.
My book. It's my book. It's behind us. So as a chief data enthusiast,
Yes.
what does your day-to-day look like?
My day-to-day, since I have a podcast, Data Podcast for Nerds, I do a lot of podcasting. I meet with all kinds of amazing professionals. I'm highlighting skills that they use on a daily basis. My passion is continuous learning and highlighting that basically everyone uses data these days. Data's everywhere, right? And so everyone's a data professional. And I really like helping people that want to transition from their boring 9-to-5s into a data career because they're like, data's so awesome. And they don't know how to do it because there's so many resources available out there that it's confusing. And so I recently started a coaching program that kind of helps people get knowing that they already have the skills, they're already using data, and it's not that big of a jump to get into a data career if they wanted to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I feel like I had kind of a career like that where I didn't start off doing particularly data-driven work. I was doing what was it? It was like Gender 101, like educational workshops. Not the most data-centric thing in the world, right? You're teaching people what gender is and what pronouns are and all that, which I feel like these days those kinds of workshops are a dime a dozen. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
But at some point I started really thinking hard about like how can we use the data that companies already collect, HR data in particular, to be actually making organizational change and like helping improve the employee experience for everyone, but especially people from marginalized groups. And so we were just talking about this, like a handful of stats classes in college. And I was like, that's enough of a data background, isn't it? And it turned out it actually was, to get started at the very least. So now I do data-driven DEI work, but I should probably take a refresher on some of the more coding aspects because I I have a broad, generalist, qualitative data background, but please don't quiz me on Python. Please do not quiz me on Python. I'm going to fail miserably, and that's probably on me. uh,
Thankfully, did you do Python a little bit in a previous time of your life? Small? Yeah.
for like one assignment in one course.
Okay,
So,
well, that means
counts.
that means that you're a professional at it. It's kind
I'm
of
a
like
fast
riding,
learner.
Yes, it's kind of like riding a bike. Like once you know a little bit about it and then you go back to it, it's like, oh yeah, that's how it works.
Yeah.
So I promise it'll be easy for you to pick it back up.
I feel like when I was learning R and learning MATLAB, I was so out of my element, and it's really funny. Coding has like never been my strong suit. I remember when I was like 10 trying to learn like HTML, and I gave up after like 2 weeks because I was just like, it's not for me. And then I tried again like 5 years later, and then I gave up again. And then I tried again 5 years later, and then I gave up again. And I'm like, maybe I'll go into like a qualitative data field. Maybe I'll do better at and it turns out I'm very good at qualitative data. So
Okay.
now that's what I do.
Yeah.
But I should probably still learn Python.
But you're still a data professional because a lot of people think that they need to program to be a data professional.
That I agree with.
But you don't.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I work with so much data. And if there's anything actually on that front, I feel like a lot of people discount the importance of qualitative data because of how coding heavy I found a lot of data focused spaces to be, right?
True.
So, I think when I talk about like analyzing qualitative comment data, right? Like everyone kind of looks down on it unless I also say, yes, and then I clean the data, I tag the data, and then I do a quantitative analysis on the qualitative data. But like, you don't have to do all of that. If you talk to 300 people and a huge chunk of them talk about how broken the hiring process is, and a huge chunk of those people talk about how it's linked directly to 3 managers, I don't have to do quantitative analysis to be like, you got some managers that are messing up your hiring process, right? Like that's technically using data, and I feel like more people need to be seeing it like that and not afraid to treat qualitative data analysis like data analysis. So
I agree. How do you show that your qualitative data isn't subjective though? Like aren't people are like, oh, that's just your
but it
opinion.
is subjective.
Yeah.
So I feel like the joy of qualitative data is it is always subjective. So different people can interpret the data in different ways. And I think that's really powerful. And frankly, I think quantitative data is similar in those ways. And I think people treat quantitative data as like the data is absolute. The data says one thing. But even with like purely quant data, like there's so many different ways to read into it, right? Because the data tells you what's happening. It doesn't tell you why it's happening, how it's happening, all the different causal factors that are impacting it. And so I find that, fundamentally using data is about finding the stories that lie in it. Whether you're doing quant data analysis or qual data analysis. So if people question my findings and they say, look, maybe you talked to 300 people and 100 of them say that something's wrong with the hiring process and 60 of them say that there's something wrong with 3 managers, but it's all bias and nothing's actually wrong, then I say, okay, then tell me about your alternative reading of the data and why you believe in what you believe, and try to convince me because I'm open to it. And if they can't give me another interesting hypothesis for why I'm seeing those findings, and I'll say, I'm sorry, but I think my interpretation is more accurate, right? Like, and I think that's, I think that's kind of how it should be, right? Like interpreting data is an art, and a science. I'm not saying it's not a science, but it's also an art, right? And there's a lot of different ways to read into it. But I'm curious to hear from you, right? Like, since I assume you mostly work with quant data, how similar or different your own experiences are to what I was talking about.
That was my first question. Is that like, oh, you never gotten, pushback when you're presenting any of your analyses of like, oh, where's the data behind it, right? Because it's always like, oh, you have to have supporting data of any of your analyses or your presentations. You're constantly like, oh, according to this report, this percentage and whatnot, and that's the facts, right? And so that's why I asked you, oh, how do you navigate through that kind of pushback of where's the data behind it?
But you get pushback too,
right?
I assume, right?
I get pushback from the what I call actually people,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So then I know we were talking a little bit a couple days ago about some research, and we found out that the population was like 11 people
Mm-hmm.
from this whole big
Oh,
white
yeah,
paper,
I
and
remember
I
we were
was
talking
like,
about that.
I would have been embarrassed to write a white paper, and my population was 11 people. And it was all one group of people.
Oh,
So it was
yes.
like,
11 young men.
yes.
11 young men. That was the language in the white paper. I don't even think it was a white paper. I think it was published as a study.
Oh, okay. That makes sense, I guess.
Yeah. But still, right? Like 11 strapping young men.
Yes, exactly. So then from the actually people, you do get pushback because it's like, oh, what was the population and what variables were you adjusting and what was your I'm blanking on words right now because I had a very long day today in recording. But they're questioning every single aspect of your analysis, and so there's definitely pushback. And I think any data person is gonna be like, well,
I've gotten
how
some of
about
that too. Yeah, and so a question that I get really often is, well, you've observed these trends, but this big macro factor was happening at the same time as you took the, ran your survey or did your whatever. And so what's the likelihood that you can chalk up 100% of what you found to gestures broadly, the economy, or gestures broadly, COVID? So maybe
environmental factors.
exactly, maybe it has nothing at all to do with us, and it's not at all our responsibility, and it's just the environment.
Yes.
To which I say that's bullshit, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's always people that are trying to get out of responsibility, and they're like, maybe it's not us. I know you said that it is us, but what's the chance that it's not, and we can throw everything you said out the door? And I'm like,
yeah,
it's not that. It's never that.
To some extent, though, you can loop in those environmental factors.
You can
and
control
test
for them.
Those.
You can control for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when I was a security auditor, I was doing some testing on incidents from our team that they were called troublemen that go out into the field, fix things, right? And we would see that there was different spikes during different months. It was like, I don't know, August and like spring and winter, right? And during those times, it was like, oh, why is there a spike? And I was like, oh, let's look at weather. Like maybe they're doing, it's really rainy, so there's lots of slips and falls and whatnot. And we found out, because we did a lot of root cause analysis type of work
Yeah.
that like they were doing their weather preparation every time.
Right.
So they were being so careful that incidents were just happening because of that environment that they were in. So
see, I'm really envious of that because I usually don't have enough access to the raw data to do like a principal components analysis, right? Like I can't really pull together those factors. So all I have to go off of usually, for a whole bunch of reasons, including like security and anonymity of the people I'm collecting data from, all I have are, let's say, people's answers to survey questions, broad kind of demographic data, and then all the qualitative data that people submit. But that's not enough to be able to say, oh, like, okay, let's isolate all of the potential factors, because that data isn't even collected, right? So I don't know, right? Like I always wish I had more data, though I guess double-edged sword, if I had more data, then maybe I'd have to use Python to analyze it, and then I'd have to learn how to do that. But like still, right? Like I constantly ask myself, like, what's the maximum amount of data that I can collect that would give me, useful value working with these folks? Because I'm working with like really sensitive information here, looking into things like racial discrimination, gender discrimination, etc. And if I ask for everything, no one's going to give it to me because these are employees, right?
Absolutely.
Like they don't want to share these things with me. But if I don't ask enough questions or get enough data, then the actuallys, right, come after me going like, well, what if it was this thing that wasn't collected? And I have to answer, I don't think it's that, but I can't prove that it wasn't because we didn't collect data on it, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of security, there's a balance of collecting all of that sensitive data and then it, having negative effects to the people that are attached to that data.
Right.
Or just completely anonymizing it, and then you kind of lose that utility.
Don't
of the
anonymize
analysis.
it. Yeah.
So it's like You have to find that perfect balance, and that perfect balance is hard to find.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because your course is about data security.
Exactly,
right?
yes.
And my course is about, or it includes demographic analysis because my course is about equity and DEI work within organizations. So when we met, it was really interesting because my perspective is like, please give me more so that I can conduct an equity analysis and figure out what's wrong with your organization. But also, you don't want to collect too much because then you violate people's anonymity and confidentiality. And then, you brought in the data security aspect of things. And I was like, whoa, we should do a podcast. So here we are. But yeah, no, like I'm curious, just kind of hearing a bit about the course that I was teaching, right? Like what connections you can draw from that to your own work. Because I mean, I don't know very much about the kind of work that you do around security. So I've never really thought about it from that perspective. If, for example, you were in this position of like doing data security for like a large organization, and that organization were to bring in a consultant like myself, right, to do an equity analysis, like how would you work with that consultant, aka me?
Yeah, it depends on like what level of work that you're talking about. So like if you're working with a complete organization from the very top, like one thing I would say is start at only giving access to data to the people that need access to the data, right? So that's that CRUD where you can create, read, update, delete. So most people, like data people, they only need read access. They don't need any more. And then even that read access, you only need read access to specific columns, right? You don't even need access to all of it to perform your analysis.
That's right.
And then you can just keep diving deeper and deeper and deeper into that.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So just stuff like that, you can, get it at the source, like only giving access to the people that need it, all the way up to analysis. When you're performing the analysis, if you already have access to PII, like some people already are giving me like dates of birth and social security numbers and all of that. And it's
you don't
like,
need that.
You don't need that, right? So social security number, that could usually just be thrown out the door.
Right.
You could do things like masking on it if you wanted to keep that for some reason.
But
like the
why?
last four as kind of like an identifier for people, right?
But you could just assign them an identifier that isn't tied to their critical information.
Very true. But if you're working in, say, like a call center where you actually have to give that information to identify yourself as the person that's calling.
So it could have
some
utility.
You at least need to have that last four, but you don't need the entire
Right. That makes
number.
sense. That makes sense.
So there's like, it's so fascinating. There's like so much involved in data security that you can like deep dive into. That's why I'm like scrambling my thoughts like, oh, where can I go with this conversation?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because the sorts of questions that I use data to answer are fairly limited, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of equity work that exists, but it's usually the only sensitive information that I get from people are their social demographics that they willingly provide. And then beyond that, right, it's like the classic HR people analytics metrics. So we look at like hiring and retention and promotion rate and all of those things. But I mean, I've never thought of like collecting the last four digits of people's social security numbers for a call center because that's not a particular social demographic that could relate to an outcome that I could care about. But it's interesting. I'm wondering, like, with so many variables, this is maybe like a slightly more data analysis question. How do you avoid like fishing expeditions? That's
it. Yes. So how do you avoid like phishing emails? Like that?
Oh,
type?
no.
Or you're talking about like social engineering?
No, like p hacking, basically. Like, how do you avoid continuing to hunt for correlations to the extent that you've done so many analyses that you guarantee a correlation?
That's good. That's good. Your manager just has to tell you to stop working because you've put too many hours into it. Because honestly, I can go down rabbit holes on analyses. Like data exploration, right? Like when you first get a data set, you're supposed to perform some kind of data exploration on your data set to understand, like, what do I have? What, all of that. You can spend definitely hours and hours and hours just on that. Right. So what I like to think of first set up like a question, like a purpose of what you're supposed to be doing with that data. And that kind of guides you on, like, if you go down that rabbit hole, then you're like, okay, bring it back because you're supposed to be answering that question.
Right. Yeah, it's just so interesting because I feel like the more variables you collect, the more likely it is that you'll find a statistically significant variation by chance.
Yes.
Right? Like if you're looking for a p of, 0.01, if you collect 100 variables, you guarantee that well, not guarantee, but like there's a high likelihood that something among those 100 will vary but just be noise, right?
That's true.
And I feel like within the work that I do, you can't always have your hypotheses going into collecting the data, right? Like if you already knew exactly what you were looking for, then you wouldn't have to collect all that data in the first place.
Yeah.
And then ideally, I think it'd be like best practice to collect more data after you create your hypotheses. But it's such a human lift, right?
Yeah.
To collect that data in the first place. I don't know, right? It's messy.
Yeah.
It's
and then
messy.
when you're saying like you'll find something, like if you're not looking for a particular thing, like you're just going to stumble on something.
Right.
Kind of like how conspiracy theories work, right? You're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is what I'm going to find.
Yeah.
And I'm determined to find this one thing.
Absolutely, right? Yeah, I'm sure we could say like the rainfall in Wisconsin happens to co-vary with the number of pencils on my boss's desk.
Ooh.
Indicating the Wisconsin pencil complex, which drives the entire machinations of our economy.
Yes.
And I have data to show it. Yeah, I don't know, right?
Exactly. Data is fun.
Spurious correlations.
Fun. Spurious correlations, it's true. But if you look for enough correlations, you'll find spurious ones. And if they're not entirely wacko, it's hard to know if they're spurious or not. Because if they look like they should covary, then it's like, well, I can't tell if they're covarying because something's actually there, or if they're covarying because I've had too much coffee and I've looked at too many variables. So,
And I've learned for my few days here that LinkedIn really loves their coffee.
Yeah, LinkedIn really likes their coffee.
Really, really.
Folks are nuts. Nuts, parentheses, positive.
I have a few selfish questions if you
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
questions
Ask
from
us
the
your
audience.
selfish
Yeah.
questions, please.
I'm curious from both of your perspective, you as a data analyst and instructor who works in data security, and you as a DEI specialist, like what do you think, I guess, can happen if things become too focused on data? Like, is that something that happens in your organizations? Like, can things become too metric driven?
I got
So
way
hit me
too
with it.
excited. Yes. So in the DEI space, I've seen like in the hiring side of it where you have to meet certain metrics on how many people from each group are hired or are existing in a certain organization, to the point where they'll turn away people because of the fact that they need to meet these metrics. Have you seen this?
Yes, asterisk. Those are called quotas.
Okay.
And quotas,
Okay.
quotas are illegal. You cannot actually mandate that X% of your workforce be X number of people. You cannot also, you cannot say, for example, that we're going to hire 25% women this month or 50% women this month. If you say that on record, you will get sued and lose. Do not do that. That's very illegal. There are hiring laws in the US that have existed for quite some time that say you cannot do that. So if you've seen that, maybe you could give them a little nudge and say, please stop breaking the law.
I love that I
and-
brought that up because I knew that you would like answer that because it's always been a thought in my head.
So quotas are very much so illegal.
Okay.
And they've been illegal for many years, probably since I want to say they've been illegal since the 70s or the 80s. So it's been quite a while. Now, that said, increasing the diversity of the total workforce is a very important goal. And so in the DEI space, we've seen a lot of talk about how we use metrics and accountability to increase this outcome that we care about without being so, I'm not even going to call it data driven, but I'll say like so obsessed with particular quotas, right, during the process, that we A, break the law, and B, no one likes that, right?
Yeah.
Like people get really upset when you say like, we're only hiring 50% women, and because you're a man, you know, that's going to make you feel like you're getting passed over. So what we've actually done, what many folks and what many lawyers also recommend in the DEI space, is to, first of all, you cannot specify a quota for the outcome, but you can specify percentages of your candidate pool that you want to see.
Okay.
So you can't say we'll hire 50% women, but you can say that our candidate pool must be 50% women before we proceed. And we'll pick the most qualified candidate of those.
Okay. So then you can turn away potential candidates
cannot
to
turn
get into
away.
your candidate pool?
You cannot turn away.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
you cannot. It's technically not illegal to tell a candidate to not apply, but it's just, first of all, I don't see anyone doing it, and it's just not best practice. So let's say your candidate pool is 100 people, and 70 of them are men, and 30 of them are women, and you want your candidate pool to be close to 50-50, right? You can't say this position is closed to men applying. That's illegal. That's discrimination.
Absolutely.
But what you can say is, I'm going to work extra hard to get women to apply until this candidate pool is as close to 50-50 as possible.
Okay.
So let's say it's 100 men and 70 men and 30 women, right? You want to eventually get it to close to 100 men and 100 women, which means after you hit that 70-30, now you're going to spend all of your efforts trying to recruit women and get them to apply to the position, and less effort recruiting men. Now, that doesn't mean you're ever going to turn anyone away.
Okay.
That's just talking about the intentional effort you spend to try to get your candidate pool closer to that 100. And from that pool, you will hire the best candidate.
Okay.
Right? You cannot specify that the final gender identity or race or whatever of candidates be a certain characteristic. That's illegal, and that's discrimination. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't even think about doing it.
Yeah.
But this really gets to an interesting complexity where, you know, it's not just about the metrics you select, it's how you use them, right? Like, I don't think there's such a thing as a bad metric, but the metrics don't know the law, right? People know the law. So you need to be really careful about how it is you create incentives and how it is you hold people accountable and how you use data, rather than just saying like, well, here's a metric, so let's do something with it. Data's great. So yeah. I don't know. Hopefully that
So
helps.
then how do you try to get only women candidates correctly without, hey, only women apply?
You can't get only women candidates.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
how do you give that extra effort to increase your women numbers more than your men numbers?
Yeah. There's lots of things you can do. You can have, for example, your listings on broad general websites end or wind down after a certain day. So, for example, like a lot of companies will spend money to boost the visibility of their listings on certain sites. So they might just let those boostings end naturally after a certain point in time and only boost the postings on, let's say, like female job sites or
Okay.
like professional development for women. If a man applies, they will absolutely let that man in, right? They'll just say, okay, we've got close to the percentage of men that we want, so we're going to shift our hiring strategy or our recruitment strategy towards the groups that we want to see more representation of.
Okay.
And that's extremely legal, and companies already do that, right? Like, for example, if they're trying to hire an engineer, they're not going to boost the algorithm to a website that hires artists.
Okay.
Right?
Makes
They're
sense.
going to focus on engineers. You can do the same thing with demographic. But if an artist applies, they're not going to turn an artist away,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same as that.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense.
The more you know, the more you know. Did that answer your question, unnamed audience member in our live studio audience?
Live Stu, that's me.
we need like a clap.
Oh, yeah.
Clap or
Just a
laugh
default
track.
clap sound.
Just insert that later. Data is representations of things in the world, right? And sometimes those things, when they're written down into a format of data, have bias in them, right? That then gets continually turned into machine learning models or that sort of thing, right? So how do you account for bias in algorithms and models that are representative of a better outcome, I guess, right? How do you account for that bias, and then how do you improve that bias so that it doesn't affect hiring, for instance, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a machine learning question, so I think you should tackle it first, and then I'll talk about the bias aspect.
Yeah. So I actually don't have an answer. That's something that's actually like not completely solvable just because it keeps getting accidentally introduced back into those machine learning models. And even if you anonymized all of your data, you get to that point that I was talking about earlier where it was like there's no more balance anymore. So then what you're trying to build that model for really doesn't even work anymore. So one example that something that's like very general is like underwriting. So like when you apply for a credit card, right? There's certain data elements that they ask for, like your credit score and your gender and your address, and all of those can be connected to certain groups of people that might not pay their bills on time. And so therefore they'll be like, no, this group of people wouldn't be a good candidate for a credit card, so we're just going to decline the credit card.
Sure. It's like redlining.
Yes.
Just algorithmically.
Yes.
Which is more insidious. Redlining is the practice of discriminating against groups of people, usually by race or by class, due to the neighborhoods that they lived in, by banks, which happened until very recently. And one of the big concerns around algorithms and machine learning is that they tend to encode the same biases that we see out in the world into the black box of an algorithm that just says yes or no, and you can't actually see what it's doing, only that its outcomes are biased. But you can only see that if you really look into it. And we've seen that from a range of algorithms, from how like police use algorithms to determine whether people are guilty, which is terrifying. And already we're seeing lots of stories about false arrests, right? People getting targeted because of their race. Not because of an individual police officer's bias, but because of lots of individual biases at scale codified into an algorithm that people don't understand, that nevertheless is just as biased, but can mask it behind being an algorithm, which somehow people believe is not biased by dint of being an algorithm, which is wrong. Algorithms are just as biased, if not sometimes more biased, than people. But yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm not an expert in this space, so please, if there are other machine learning experts out here that are, I'd love you to chime in to this conversation on this podcast.
Send comments below.
Yeah, check the comments below.
Like and subscribe also.
Absolutely. But I think it's interesting because if you ask the right questions, you can test the outputs of your algorithm, right? Like, I remember there was some pretty seminal work done in MIT by Joy Buolamwini, who looked into the efficacy of algorithms to like categorize people's faces by race and gender. And there's really incredible detailed data on how for white men, the accuracy was close to 100%. For white women, the accuracy was very high, close to 100%. And then for men of color, it dropped quite a lot. And then for women of color, it dropped disastrously. But I feel like, you can observe things like that and then make conclusions about your algorithm, right? You can train it by saying like, okay, we're going to prompt it on the thing that I expect it to make the most mistakes on. And I believe you can give it feedback that it's making these kinds of mistakes, right? Adversarial learning, I believe, right? You can train another algorithm to tell the first algorithm if it's messing up, and it probably is, right? So I don't know enough about what the process actually looks like, but I have to believe that it's possible to train an algorithm out of bias so long as you are aware of how that bias manifests and can collect good data on how those outcomes, or at least outputs of the algorithm differ, right? Like if your algorithm is incorrectly rejecting credit score applications or, mortgage applications, for example, on bias, you should be able to have it analyze, 1,000, 10,000 sample applications and have people go over it too, and then say, look, if the algorithm makes X amount of mistakes here, then it's clearly got some sort of bias at scale. So what can we do to correct that, and then run the test again to see if it makes those same mistakes? So I could be misunderstanding it, but I don't believe it's inevitable to have these kinds of biases hard coded into our systems, right? Like, we can do better.
Yeah.
I think
We can do better. Also with a balance, with that learning on those areas that you know that it's lacking, you can overcorrect that. Because it's what you're presenting into your training model is obviously what it's being trained on. So there's not enough of a certain demographic in your training set, which is why those instances are happening, right? So then if you overcorrect, then it kind of throws everything in the other direction. So again, there's a balance that needs to happen.
But if you overcorrect, you'll be able to see it then, right? Like if its outputs start favoring a certain group, then either way, it's not working.
You would hope you would, but a lot of folks don't really monitor their models.
So they apply one fix and then assume that it's going to be enough?
Yeah. So from an audit perspective, you should be going back to your models and reevaluating due to, say, environmental changes, right? And then adjusting for those to make everything kind of course correct itself. But people kind of do that, set it and forget it. They build the model and they're like, okay, it's good for life. And they never go back to adjust anything. So then it doesn't always get caught because of the monitoring perspective.
You know, the really funny thing is that I might not be a machine learning expert, but I do a lot of work with human systems inside workplaces. And honestly, it's the exact same pattern, right? Someone will build a promotions process or a hiring process. They'll set it and forget it, right? It'll be extremely biased at scale. And then someone comes in and says, look, it's biased. They're correct. You should fix it. That's also correct. We're going to fix it like this. And then they don't look at it. They don't see what happens. They don't examine the outcomes of their intervention. So they don't know if it works. They don't know if it corrected it. They don't know if it overcorrected it. And it's a huge problem in my field, right, in the DEI field, because we often assume that when you see something broken, any intervention to fix it will just be successful and have no unintended side effects and no consequences. And just, people just kind of walk away from it. And that's really bad, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can have interventions that make things worse than the original. Sometimes you can have interventions that go too far. It's relatively rare, but it can happen. And then, sometimes you have interventions that work perfectly the first time. But if you don't collect data and you don't test your model, right? But, in this case, the model is a human workplace system rather than a machine learning algorithm, then you don't know, right? And you're not going to have that accountability. You're not going to have the data to know if the problem is solved or if things are fixed. We talk about that in my course, which you should take. It's about equity.
I also have a course.
Yeah.
It's maybe about security.
It better be about security. Tell us about your course.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's about data security and anonymizing your data. Yeah. I think that sums it up.
Yeah. Nice. Nice.
And you?
It's about equity, part of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we attain it in our workplaces.
What would you recommend somebody who's listening to this podcast, do after this, other than watch your course, which you just plugged? Do you have a podcast? Do you have a website? Do you have anything they could follow you on?
Absolutely.
You have a podcast.
I do have a podcast, Data Podcast for Nerds. I'm on LinkedIn as well as YouTube, Spotify, and all of the cool streaming platforms. So go ahead and take a listen there. I live on LinkedIn. I'm not just saying that, I actually do. And so follow me there. And I think that's about it. Over to Lily.
Nice. I don't have a podcast and will never make one. So if future Lily does it, you can show this clip to them. But I spend a lot of time on other people's podcasts. So you can search for Lily Zheng podcasts and find the Too Many podcasts that I've showed up on. So you can go ahead and watch those. I also spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, so you can go ahead and check me out there, and also reach out to me on my website, lilyzhang.co, if you're interested in working together on designing an equity initiative for your organization that actually fixes your shit. And you've probably got some to fix. Just saying.
Love it. I agree. As a former auditor, all companies have shit to fix, so I agree.
Thanks for watching
Yes.
or listening.
Absolutely. And as always, folks, happy learning.
Oh,
That's
I
my
like
cheesy
that.
sign off.
Wait, I like that. That's so good.